Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we bring a little joy to the world by talking about the prophets, heroes, and kings that we read about in the Haftarot. Today, in this penultimate episode of the Haftarah Plethora for the second day of Sukkot, we get a chance to revisit a Haftarah that we previously read and discussed for Pikudei. But first, I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine wine and talking Haftarah with my very good friend, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing today, Rick?
Well, I'm excited that we're getting ready for Sukkot, but I'm perplexed by your intro. Penultimate episode. And what's this about revisiting a Haftarah? And don't you have something else that you are celebrating?
Good questions, Rick. First of all, as I'm sure you know, we've recorded an episode of the Haftarah Plethora for 83 different Haftarot.
Wow.
And there are only 2 more to go. This one for the second day of Sukkot, and then the Haftarah for Simchat Torah.
And we're doing that one live in Shul.
Well, kind of. We'll be doing a very abbreviated version, but we're also recording it as usual for our final episode. The Haftarah is the first chapter of the book of Joshua, all narrative. It should be fun. But back to the Haftarah for the second day of Sukkot. We read another narrative from chapter 8 of the first book of Kings. But Rick, you will recall that we already discussed and you chanted most of this Haftarah last year. This was the Haftarah for Parshat Pikudei, except then we also added the last verse of chapter 7 and the first verse of chapter 8.
Hold on there, Zadie. Before we get to the Haftarah, isn't there something else you want to share with us?
Rick, I thought you'd never ask.
I asked twice now. Time to share the news.
Okay. Rick, it's been a long time since we've done a segment of It's Millie Time. So long that now it's time to present a new segment with a new title, It's Millie and Izzy Time.
Mazel tov.
Rick, our second grandchild and first grandson, Isaac Harrison Herman, or Yitzchak Tzvi ben Aharon Mordechai and Chava Yehudit Binyamina, was born almost right on schedule just before Yom Kippur.
And it looks like he's being introduced to his sister Millie.
Millie was a little uncertain of what to make of him.
I can see that. She's making a funny face. But Mom and Dad look real happy.
She's slowly getting used to having a brother around, but I guess that's normal.
Very normal. Looks like she'd rather play with the panda bear. But there's the picture that we were waiting for. Isaac with his Zadie. Hey, where's Savta?
Rick, Diane had a nasty virus, so she was keeping her distance. But next week we'll have some photos from the Brit Milah.
Hey, how are you going to decide who to hold while dancing with the Torah on Simchat Torah? I guess I should already schedule his lessons for teaching him his Parsha.
Boy, you really plan ahead. His Parsha is Ha'azinu, so he'll definitely have an interesting Torah reading and Haftarah. But let's get back to the Haftarah for the second day of Sukkot.
Well, since we already did most of this one, what more is there to say?
First of all, in the episode for Pikudei, we ended up talking a lot about the alternative readings for that Shabbat. Secondly, there's the question of why the sages chose this same reading for Sukkot Day 2, and why they decided not to include the last verse of chapter 7 and the first verse of chapter 8. And finally, you always have such interesting things to say about the trope that I thought I'd give you a chance to expand upon your trope drash for these verses.
How kind of you, sir. So why did the sages choose this reading for two different Shabbatot?
Well, Rick, as we explained in the episode for Pikudei, the Torah reading for Pikudei describes the completion of the Mishkan, or tabernacle, by Moses and the anthropomorphic entry of the divinity into the shrine in the form of a cloud. The Haftarah parallels this with Solomon's completion of the temple and God's similar smoky entrance.
Okay, but why use this same reading for Sukkot?
Well, the Eitz Chaim Chumash has one explanation, and I have another.
Of course, you can't just accept the traditional commentary, can you?
I wouldn't be me, and I hope that Millie and Izzy follow in that tradition. So the traditional explanation focuses on the cloud and God's smoky entrance into the Mishkan.
Yes, I recall your somewhat irreverent suggestion that both the Parsha and the Haftarah were a bit of an illusion that got out of hand.
Right, or perhaps a workplace accident, kind of like a barbecue that flares up and catches fire to the surroundings.
Sounds like you've had some experience with that phenomena.
Yes, back in my meat eating days, one time I almost burned down Rabbi Rembam's apartment. But that's another story. In any case, the sages thought that the cloud over the Mishkan and the temple were symbolic of the protection of the sukkah, as in the phrase, Ufros aleinu sukkot shlomecha.
Is that line in the Haftarah?
No, but it's one of my favorites, spread over us the sukkah of peace, which is one of the images of the holiday as we dwell in the sukkah. And the holiday of Sukkot does commemorate the wanderings of Bnei Yisrael as they were accompanied and protected by God, taking the physical form of the pillar of smoke or cloud.
Sounds like a stretch to me.
Me too, which is why I like my explanation better. The dedication of the temple is often associated with the holiday of Sukkot. In fact, one of the names of the holiday is the Feast of Tabernacles, teaching us that our Sukkot should be like the Mishkan or the temple. And as I said in our episode for Pikudei, the Haftarah makes the connection between the temple, the ark that Solomon brought into it, and the covenant between God and the ancestors. We should strive to do the same when we construct and use our Sukkot.
Okay, that also sounds a little bit of a stretch, but I like it. How about if I spread over you and our viewers some of my trope commentary?
With pleasure, Rick.
Well, no one can miss the Kadmavia's law that grabs the listener at the very beginning of the Haftarah. Vayikahalu, they congregated, or they assembled. Or is it he made them congregate? Is it the normal active verb, or is it he feel, a causative verb?
Wow, that's starting with some high-level grammar.
Okay, so let's make it simpler. We're told that this happened bechag, but how do we know which chag? Sukkot, of course, because wherever we read about the chag, the rabbis meant Sukkot, like chag zman simchatenu. And that may well be the reason that the sages started the Haftarah on verse 2.
Excellent catch there, Rick.
Turning to verse 7, I like the Dargat Tavir, the intensity of it. An vayasoku hakruvim, the kruvim shielded. Note that vayasoku has the same root as the word Sukkot, Sameach, Kaf, and Hey. Shielded, protected, covered.
Very nice. And in keeping with the traditional explanation of the link between the Haftarah and the holiday, you're on a roll, Rick.
So let's move to verse 9. I like the yativ, the drama there on the opening word of the verse. Ain, there was nothing in the ark except for the 2 tablets.
Okay, but what's the significance of there only being the 2 tablets of stone?
Nothing more is needed. The covenant between the people and God doesn't require anything more than a few words carved on stone. Keep it simple, like the Sukkah. Moving on and returning to one of my common themes, we have a Munach Zakif Katon combination in verse 12. Shlomo says to the assembly, Adonai Amar, God says. And what does God say? That he intended to dwell in a thick cloud.
Rick, if I can interject here, there's an irony in this verse and in the next. God intended to dwell in the clouds above the people. It was only because the people required God to dwell among them that it was necessary to build a Mishkan and later a temple. I think that there's a bit of ambiguity in verse 13. Can you chant the verse for us?
Sure. Bano vaniti beit zivul lach machon l'shivtecha olamim.
I have now built for you a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever. It's unclear if Shlomo is speaking in his own voice, meaning that he, Solomon, built the house for God, or if this is a continuation of Solomon speaking in the name of God, so that God built the temple for the people to use to interact with God.
Whatever he meant, the next thing Solomon did was to bless his congregation with a Zakef Gadol, an Vayevarech, stands out, telling us that the blessing stands alone. And notice that the blessing starts, Baruch Adonai Elohei Yisrael, which is very similar to a line we recite each morning in Psukei de Zimra, just before the Az Yashir, except there it's attributed to David as part of his last speech in First Chronicles, where he hands over his kingdom to his son Solomon. Continuity, just saying.
Rick, Solomon really wanted to emphasize continuity. In verses 16 through 20, he concisely explains to the assemblage that God wanted to establish a city that would be a place of worship for all the tribes of Israel, that his father David intended to carry out that task, but that God decided that it would be Solomon who would build the temple. This culminates in verse 20, where Solomon makes sure that the people know who was responsible for building the temple. Here's Robert Alter's translation of the first part of that verse. And Adonai has fulfilled his work that he spoke, and I arose in place of David my father.
Exactly. But there are three sets of tropes at the beginning of the verse that suggest that Solomon may be both giving and taking credit. The verse starts with, Vayakem Adonai, and God fulfilled his promise. Here we have a Munach Zakef Katon combo as a signal of that importance. Next, we have the only pazer in the Haftarah on the most important word, at least according to Solomon. Va'akum, and I arose to take the place of my father. It's mostly about me, Solomon. But then we have David Avi, David my father, with a dramatic Kadma v'Azla, perhaps showing a bit of respect.
True, Rick, but the verse concludes leaving no doubt. Solomon says, and I ascended to the throne of Israel, as Adonai promised, and I have built the house for the name of Adonai, God of Israel.
And even more, the same Munach Zakef Katon used for God at the beginning of the verse is also used on Va'evneh habayit, I built the temple. Were the Masoretes suggesting that Solomon is comparing himself to God?
Ooh, Rick, I think we'll leave that one to our viewers to decide. How about if you chant the Haftarah in its entirety? It can be found on page 1257 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash.
But first the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Vayikalu el hamelech Shlomo kol ish Yisrael beyerach ha'etanim bechag hu HaChodesh HaShvi'i Vayavo'u Kol Ziknei Yisrael Vayisu HaKohanim Et HaAron Vaya'alu Et Aron Adonai Ve'et Ohel Moed Ve'kol Klei HaKodesh Asher ba'ohel vaya'alu otam hakohanim v'halavim. והמלך שלמה, וכל עדת ישראל הנועדים עליו, איתו לפני הארון, מזבחים צאן ובקר, אשר לא יספרו ולא יימנו מרוב. ויביאו הכהנים את ארון ברית אדוני אל מקומו, אל דביר הבית, אל קודש הקודשים, אל תחת כנפי הכרובים, כי הכרובים פורסים כנפיים אל מקום הארון, ויסוקו הכרובים על הארון ועל בדיו מלמעלה. ויעריכו הבדים, ויראו ראשי הבדים מן הקודש על פני הדביר, ולא יראו החוצה, ויהיו שם עד היום הזה. אין בארון רק שני לוחות אבנים, אשר הניח שם משה בחורב, אשר קראת אדוני עם בני ישראל בצאתם מארץ מצרים. ויהי בצאת הכהנים מן הקודש, והענן מלא את בית אדוני, ולא יכלו הכהנים לעמוד לשרת מפני הענן, כי מלא כבוד אדוני את בית אדוני. אז אמר שלמה, אדוני אמר לשכון בערפל, בנו בניתי בית זבול לך, מכון לשבטך עולמים. ויסב המלך את פניו, ויברך את כל קהל ישראל, וכל קהל ישראל עומד. ויאמר, ברוך אדוני אלוהי ישראל, אשר דיבר בפיו את דוד אבי, ובידו מילא לאמור, מן היום אשר הוצאתי את עמי את ישראל ממצרים, לא בחרתי ועיר מכל שבטי ישראל, לבנות בית להיות שמי שם, ואבחר בדוד להיות על עמי ישראל. ויהי עם לבב דוד אבי לבנות בית לשם אדוני אלוהי ישראל. ויאמר אדוני אל דוד אבי, יען אשר היה עם לבבך לבנות בית לשמי, היטיבותה כי היה עם לבבך, רק אתה לא תבנה הבית, כי אם בנך היוצא מחלציך, הוא יבנה הבית לשמי. ויקם אדוני את דברו אשר דיבר, ואקום תחת דוד אבי, ואשב על כיסא ישראל, כאשר דיבר אדוני, ואבנה הבית לשם אדוני אלוהי ישראל, ואשים שם מקום לארון, אשר שם ברית אדוני, אשר כרת עם אבותינו, בהוציאו אותם מארץ מצרים.
As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, music, text, and editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. We'll be back next week with our final, ultimate, concluding episode for Simchat Torah. In the meantime, we wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Happy Sukkot.